Greetings Internet, my name is Old Rod and this is a video about Pokemon cards. We've been looking at Pojo Magazine and their power rating system. So far we've covered all of the Pokemon in the base set, and this video we'll be going through all of the trainers. We'll be checking out what power ratings Pojo gave them back in 1999, deciding how well those ratings are holding up 25 years later, and re-rating them to what they'd be scored in today's base fossil metagame. 3 or above playable, anything below not worth the deck space. Right then, time for the greatest selection of trainers ever released. And first up, Clefairy Doll. Play Clefairy Doll as if it were a basic Pokemon instead of a trainer card. Clefairy Doll has no attacks, can't retreat, and can't be asleep, confused, paralysed or poisoned. If Clefairy Doll is KO'd, your opponent doesn't get a prize card, and you can discard Clefairy Doll anytime during your turn before your attack. Pojo gave Clefairy Doll a 1.5. With the strat, what can you do with this little doll? Try using it to soak up a few hit points whilst you are regrouping. Well, 1 hit point, Pojo. Just the one. Clefairy Doll. Is Pojo's strategy of sending out a Clefairy Doll whilst you regroup a viable one? If you're trying to stall for time, you're almost certainly better off doing anything else. Maybe send out a Licky Tongue to soak up some damage and try and paralyse with a tongue wrap. Or instead of using up your trainer slots with Clefairy Dolls, why not replace them with energy removals and delay your opponent's attacking threat that way? Basically, giving yourself a stay of execution for 1 turn is a far less useful tactic than doing something to either pressure or disrupt your opponent. I'm sure we can all dream up scenarios where a perfectly timed Clefairy Doll can buy you the 1 turn you need to win the game, but it's better off if you're not in that position in the first place. One potential use for Clefairy Doll is filling up your bench with them to power up Wigglytuff's Do the Wave. But wouldn't you rather have a bench full of Dodrios, Magmars, Hitmonchans, cards that can actually do stuff? And even so, Clefairy Doll's utility as either bench sitter or cannon fodder was made totally redundant once the Fossil expansion brought us Mysterious Fossil, a card that functioned exactly the same way as Clefairy Doll, but could also evolve into stuff. Clefairy Doll arguably has a really niche use in later formats, alongside Vending Hypno, whose Puppet Master Pokemon power allows it to attack with Clefairy Doll from the bench, meaning you can deal damage without risking giving up a prize. Or in Base Rocket with Alakazam's Teleport Blast, allowing you to switch into a Clefairy Doll and hide from your opponent's attacks. These decks are more fun than tournament winning, but they do give the little doll something to do. Unfortunately, in Base Fossil, I honestly don't think there's any use for it. Pojo gave Clefairy Doll a 1.5. Whatever fringe uses it may have, Mysterious Fossil already has you covered. Sorry Clefairy Doll, but I have to give you a 1. Next up, Computer Search. Discard 2 cards from your hand in order to search your deck for any card and put it into your hand. Pojo gave Computer Search a 4.5 out of 5 with the strat. Computer Search is a useful card because it helps you tailor your hand to the opposition. Getting to search your deck for any card you want is obviously very useful and very strong. It's such a strong effect that in later formats, Computer Search was reprinted as a once per game ace spec card. So, what's the strategy with Computer Search? Well, it depends on the deck you're running and it depends on your game situation. Early game you can use Computer Search to grab a Professor Oak to put yourself in the driver's seat. Or alas, to ruin your opponent's hand, a PlusPower or Gust of Wind to get that critical knockout, or maybe you just need to find that DCE to unleash a big attack. Almost every deck will benefit from at least 1 Computer Search, and there are certain decks that max out on them, running the full 4 copies. These decks are the turbo decks like Rain Dance and Buzz Arcanine. These decks need to put together a specific combination of cards very quickly, and thus they're not worried about discarding resources early game, they're just trying to get together the bits they need and win as quickly as possible. These bad boys aren't worried about burning through their resources. Other decks like Dodrio Haymaker or Wigglytuff don't have to rely on specific card combos as much. They're much better off just drawing through their decks with multiple Bills and Professor Oaks instead of having to discard 2 cards to find something specific. But still, even these decks could run 1 or 2 computer searches since they're really useful. You never know when you might need one. The Lickitung Stall decks might not need to play any computer searches. These decks don't need to evolve anything, aren't relying on specific card combos, and are playing at such a slow pace that their hand tends to fill up with all the disruptive trainers before you know it. Computer Search's biggest downside is having to discard 2 cards from hand, which can feel expensive. However, there are ways to negate this downside. Promo Mewtwo combos really well with Computer Search, since you can discard 2 energies from your hand, then instantly recover them with energy absorption. The same applies with energy retrieval. Or you can choose to discard cards like Lass, which may not be useful early game, but can be retrieved later with Item Finder when it is needed. Pojo gave Computer Search a 4.5. I feel like in the current meta, Computer Search isn't as popular as it once was, with many decks favouring just pure draw power instead of having to discard their resources in a format where resource management is absolutely crucial. Rain Dance and Buzz Arcanine still need the full playset of computer searches, and I always put at least 1 in any of my decks. Sometimes it can really turn the tide in your favour. I'm going to give Computer Search a still fantastic 4 out of 5. Next up, Devolution Spray. Remove the highest stage evolution from one of your evolved Pokemon and discard that card. Your new devolved Pokemon is no longer afflicted by any status conditions. Pojo gave Devolution Spray a 1.5 out of 5, with the strat: a last-ditch tactical card you should only use when you have a powerful Stage 1 or Stage 2 in imminent danger. Easy pull from packs. So look, in general you don't want to be devolving any Pokemon, especially when that evolution card gets discarded. In Base Fossil there are maybe 3 evolutions that could benefit from Devolution Spray. A Vileplume that you want to turn back into a Gloom to use its Foul Odour attack. A Haunter you want to devolve into Ghastly and use energy conversion. Or perhaps a Charizard that's become stranded in the active position and has run out of energy. Out of these options, the only time I've ever seen Devolution Spray in a deck is to rescue a stranded Charizard. If you want to reuse your Glooms and Ghastlies, then maybe try not evolving them all in the first place. It's like in Venusaur decks when you don't want to evolve every single Ivysaur or Bulbasaur in case you have to deal with a Mr. Mime. It's a much better strategy to just, hold back, instead of dedicating a space in your deck to a very situational card like Devolution Spray. I guess it does clear status effects, which could be useful if your evolved Pokemon powerhouse, like a Venusaur or Blastoise, is stranded active and confused, but Switch is a much better card for this situation, especially since it doesn't involve you discarding your Pokemon. In Base Neo, Devolution Spray gets a fantastic makeover with the introduction of the much better Hyper Devolution Spray. This allows you to devolve your Pokemon without having to discard them. This card is the building block to the format's best deck, the Dark Bats, allowing you to continuously snipe baby Pokemon on the bench with the Bat's Pokemon powers. Pojo gave Devolution Spray a 1.5. They clearly weren't impressed, and to be honest, neither am I. I think Charizard decks are the only viable decks that could use Devolution Spray, since a stranded Charizard can lose you a game. You often don't get to use Charizard's Fire Spin more than once anyway, and Charmeleon is a decent card to be left with. Very niche, and most top decks will have 0 use for it. I'm giving Devolution Spray a 2. Wait a minute, that's not the real. That's an Imposter Professor Oak. Your opponent shuffles his or her hand into their deck and draws 7 cards. Pojo gave Imposter Professor Oak a 1.5 out of 5, with the strat: play it when you think your opponent has his hand and attacks all set, watch his face for signs of confidence, then zing! So, getting to shuffle your hand into your deck and then draw 7 cards is amazing. That's why Professor Elm is such a great trainer in the Neo expansion. So why on earth would you want your opponent to do this? Well, the short answer is you wouldn't. Even if your opponent has built up a huge handful of resources, reducing their hand back to 7 is still fine. The only real use for this card would be in the grindy endgame between two players who are no longer looking to take prizes and are just hoping to win by deck out. If your opponent has more cards in deck than you, but has a hand fewer than 7, you can Imposter Oak them to make them draw more cards, and ideally put their deck count lower than yours, turning the tables. This isn't a terrible strategy, and in the gym expansion a card was released, Tickling Machine, that allowed you to effectively mill your opponents to deck out by playing Imposter Oak if they had 7 or less cards in deck, since Tickling Machine would stop them from shuffling their hand back into their deck to replenish it. In Base Fossil, you're much better off relying on either Lass or Gambler to shuffle cards back into your deck late game. Gambler allows you to recycle a potentially huge hand, and Lass similarly allows you to stockpile trainers to recycle, as well as being a great disruption card early game. As such, Imposter Oak just isn't a card you see in any decks. Whether it's pure stalling with Licky Tongue, milling with Moltres, or just the late game stalemate that can happen in any match, Lass and Gambler are just way more useful than Imposter Oak. Furthermore, if you Imposter Oak a player who has a Lass or Gambler in hand, then they're just going to be able to redraw it and reuse it, sort of defeating the point. Pojo gave Imposter Professor Oak a 1.5. Maybe Moltres decks are the best use for Imposter Oak? Making your opponent draw through their deck and then milling what's left with Wildfire could be a mad way to victory. But giving your opponent card advantage never feels good. Late game it might cause a surprise deck out victory, but it won't counter late game Lasses or Gamblers, so it's probably best just to run those. I'm giving the Imposter a 2. Next up, Item Finder. Discard 2 cards from your hand, choose a trainer card from your discard pile and put it into your hand. Pojo gave Item Finder a 4.5 out of 5 with the strat: 1 in your deck is great for finding the perfect card late game. Pojo are nearly on the right lines here. Item Finder is the greatest late game card of all. But why only play 1? For me, every deck needs at least 2 Item Finders, and the Licky Tongue stall decks play 4, as their late games utterly depend on them. Now, on the surface, Item Finder may look like a worse computer search. For the same cost, you have to search your discard pile, not your deck, and only for trainers, not anything you like. But this is the beauty of Item Finder. For each copy of Item Finder, you can reuse any trainer you like, thus allowing you to play smaller counts of a wider variety of trainer cards, giving you more options, particularly late game. Computer Search lets you find cards, Item Finder gives you extra copies of them. Early game it can be used to recover a Professor Oak to help you set up, or a Super Energy Removal to stall your opponent. And remember, if you're running all 8 energy removal cards, along with a full set of Item Finders, that's 20 energy cards you can discard from your opponent. No mercy. But late game is where Item Finder really shines. So often games are won with the timely use of a PlusPower or Gust of Wind, and Item Finder lets you find them when you need them. Item Finder's recursive power also means you don't have to worry about discarding certain trainers early game. If you've oaked away all your Lasses on turn 1, never fear, Item Finder will dig them out for you late game. With Item Finder, a discarded trainer is never lost, it's just waiting in the wings. Whereas most decks will probably run 2 Item Finders, Licky Tongue stalls run the full 4. Not just to recur the scoop ups and super energy removals that stop your opponent taking prizes, but in the end game of the stall deck mirror match, it often comes down to who can use Psyduck's Headache Attack to trainer lock the opponent, stopping them from playing Gambler and thus decking them out. One of the only ways to counter Psyduck's endgame trainer lock is to either KO it or put a special condition on it with either Ghastly or Licky Tongue. However, if you've saved your Item Finders, you can just recycle all your scoop ups, constantly healing your Psyduck and continuing the trainer lock until your opponent decks out. This is why Item Finder is the best late game card in the entire format. It's the card that allows the best deck in the format to not just beat everything else, but even beat itself. Pojo gave Item Finder a 4.5. They're right about its late game power, but definitely include more than one in your deck. The only downside to the card is that if you're unlucky enough to draw them all early game, they can be rather useless, and having to oak them away just to get set up is a major blow. But still, if you can keep hold of them, Item Finder is the card that wins you matches. So many victories come from having access to that game-winning Gust, PlusPower, or Lass in the endgame, and it's often thanks to Item Finder. I'm keeping Item Finder at 4.5. Moving on to Lass. You and your opponent show each other your hands, then you both shuffle all trainer cards into your decks. Pojo gave Lass what looks like a 3 3/4 out of 5. Anyway, their strategy was more useful since Fossil hit the scene. Useful against those run you out of cards decks. Funny how Pojo seemed to link the Fossil expansion with the run you out of card decks. Alakazam decks were already a thing, and Lickitung existed, although its full power had yet to be realised. Are they referring to Moltres Mill? Maybe Slowpoke Scavenge shenanigans? Who knows? Anyway, there are two uses for Lass. One is hand disruption, and the other is deck replenishment. In terms of hand disruption, if you've got a strong setup early game and you think your opponent does not, if you lass them and manage to have them shuffle away all their setup cards like Professor Oak or Computer Search, then your opponent is at a huge disadvantage, leaving them with a dead hand and a massive mountain to climb. Whereas most decks will run 1, maybe 2 Lass, the Buzzap decks will run the full playset of 4. They'll chain search cards together to get set up quick, then lass away their opponent's hand, preventing them from playing energy removals, hoping to then knock everything out in the next couple of turns before their opponent can recover. And for most other, less blitzkrieg decks, a timely Lass is often the only way to stop the onslaught of energy removals and scoop-ups when facing Lickitung builds. If you're not running Lass, then you'll have a tough time ever getting the upper hand against stall decks and their seemingly endless supply of disruptive resources. Lass's second use is in the endgame, when both players have ground to a stalemate and are now hoping to win by deck out. If you've managed your resources well and been frugal with your trainer use, stockpiling trainers for the endgame allows you to play Lass, shuffle them all back into your deck, replenish your deck count, and hopefully stop you from decking out before your opponent. Players without access to a late game Lass become far more susceptible to deck out losses, making Lass pretty much an auto-include in every deck. Pojo gave Lass a 3 3/4. With two uses that can win you a game, every deck needs at least one Lass. Well, maybe not Lickitung Stall, they've got Gambler. But everything else does, and if you're running Electrode, you're wanting the whole playset. Plus, getting to see your opponent's hand is always a nice little bonus. I'm giving Lass a 4.5. Love is in the air, it's the Pokemon Breeder. Pokemon Breeder allows you to put a Stage 2 evolution onto its basic form, bypassing its Stage 1 form. However, you can't do this on the turn the basic was played. Pojo gave Pokemon Breeder a 3 out of 5, with the strat, this card is essential in the Blastoise Rain Dance deck. Well, Pojo are right. Rain Dance is synonymous with Pokemon Breeder. Rain Dance's ideal setup is to evolve up Squirtle to Blastoise on turn 2, allowing you to either smash your opponent for 60 or power up your other water beasts. Such an early setup is tough for your opponents to deal with. And to achieve this, Rain Dance decks will always play the full set of Pokemon Breeders, often foregoing poor middle stage Wartortle entirely. Of course, there are a few other Stage 2 Pokemon that are useful. Do those decks run Pokemon Breeder? Well, it depends. Alakazam decks might want one or two, since Kadabra isn't very useful, and you want to get damage swapping ASAP. Gengar decks probably don't, since both its pre-evolved forms are really good, and Curse is a power best used in the late game, when there are more damage counters to move around. Dragonite decks might include one, but Dragonair is a decent enough card perhaps not to warrant it. And Venusaur decks might include one, but for Energy Trans to be useful, you need to have accumulated a bunch of grass energy first, so a turn 2 Venusaur isn't going to be able to do much. Plus, you need to run those Ivysaurs to deal with late game Mr. Mimes. In decks that don't require turn 2 Stage 2s, Breeder isn't needed. You might run one breeder just to surprise your opponent with a sudden evolution, but really, the only deck that breeder is essential for is Rain Dance. But there is one word of warning for all you Pokemon breeders out there: beware Mew's Devolution Beam. If you're running a Blastoise with 50 damage counters on it, and it gets devolved right the way down to a Squirtle because you haven't played Wartortle, that little Squirtle is getting knocked out. Anyway, Pojo gave Pokemon Breeder a 3. Sure, Pokemon Breeder is only really used in Rain Dance decks, but Rain Dance is a very good deck, and Pokemon Breeder is a very essential part of it. So, I'm going to boost Pokemon Breeder's score up to a 3.5. An Abra for a Mr. Mime, a Slowbro for a Lickitung. It's the Pokemon Trader. Pokemon Trader lets you trade one Pokemon from your hand for any Pokemon in your deck. Pojo gave Pokemon Trader a 4 out of 5 with the strat: lets you get the perfect Pokemon for your current situation. Pokemon Trader is a card you'll only see in evolution decks, whether that's to help you find the evolution card you need right now, or preserve an evolution card for later in the game. Maybe you've got a benched Jigglypuff and a handful of Dodrio. Well, trade a Dodrio in for a Wigglytuff. Maybe you've got a Clefable in hand, but really need to be applying pressure with your Hitmonchan. Well, get trading. Or maybe you've got a Venusaur in hand, but you also need to play your Professor Oak. Trade that Venusaur away for a basic, bench it, then draw until your heart's content. Decks that are only running basic Pokemon like Lickitung Stool or Classic Haymaker don't need Pokemon Trader, as they can bench any Pokemon they like before simply drawing away with Professor Oak. Pojo gave Pokemon Trader a 4. Back in 1999, decks were often running over 20 Pokemon and lots of different evolution lines, and fewer than a dozen trainers. So yeah, with all those different Pokemon going on, you can see why Pokemon Trader was rated so highly. Nowadays, decks will simply run more trainers so that they can draw into the cards they need. But in mid-tempo evolution decks like Venusaur, Dodrio, Dragonite, Vileplume, Pokemon Trader is still a useful, if not game-changing, card to have access to. I'm giving Pokemon Trader a 3.5. Next up, Scoop Up. Choose one of your Pokemon in play, return the basic Pokemon to your hand, and discard everything else attached to it. Pojo gave Scoop Up a 4 out of 5, saying, "A fantastic card. Chansey has 10 damage counters on it? Not anymore." Scoop Up is a card with several uses, and often those uses go hand in hand. First of all, by returning a damaged Pokemon to your hand, it completely heals it. The example Pojo give is with Chansey, which is fair enough, especially in an Alakazam damage swap deck. But in 2025, Scoop Up's most notorious partner is Lickitung. Lickitung, with its high HP, single energy paralysing attack, and synergy with super energy removal, is a seriously tough knockout. And what do good Lickitung players do? Well, they wait till Lickitung has about 70 damage on it, then scoop it up, promote a Scyther, put Licky back down on the bench, pivot into it, and continue the tongue wrap onslaught. All that hard work down the drain. Because Lickitung is a basic Pokemon and only requires a single energy, Scoop Up's downsides of discarding energy and evolution cards is totally moot. And yeah, the best deck in the format, Lickitung Stool, runs 4 of these, along with 4 item finders. Good luck ever taking a prize off of Lickitung. Lickitung isn't the only big basic that benefits from Scoop Up's healing powers. Ditto is a card that relies on Scoop Up, since a Ditto with 5 damage counters on it can't retreat to the bench without KOing itself. Other cards like Scyther and Magmar can also soak up damage whilst rarely having many energy cards on them, making them other prime Scoop Up beneficiaries. And then there's Scoop Up's other utility: rescuing a Pokemon stranded in the active. If you're running Hitmonchan without a Dodrio line, then you'll need to be running Scoop Ups for when Hitmonchan is confronted by a fighting resistant opponent. Kangaskhan is another card that needs Scoop Up. Early game, once you've fetched into your setup, you're not going to want to pay 3 energy to retreat. Just scoop it up. Scoop Up can also save you from when your opponent gusts something active in order to stall you, whether it be a costly retreater, a Pokemon that's resisted, or a high damage attacker against a Mr. Mime. And as mentioned earlier, scoop-ups are vital in the headache trainer lock endgame between two stall decks, allowing you to rescue a paralysed Psyduck, since the first player to break the duck lock will be able to play Gambler and pretty much win the game. Pojo gave Scoop-Up a 4. Serving as both a Switch and Pokemon nurse in one, Scoop-Up is obviously good for many scenarios. Its only downside is that you don't want to use it on your evolution cards, or high energy attackers. But those things don't matter when its main purpose is healing Lickitungs and rescuing Psyducks as part of the best deck in the format. I'm giving Scoop-Up a 4.5. Oh boy. Next up is the card that puts off all the newbies. It's Super Energy Removal. Discard one energy card attached to one of your Pokemon in order to discard 2 energy cards attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Pojo gave Super Energy Removal a 4.5 out of 5 with the strat: Short Circuit a Zapdos, dry out a Poliwrath. You can get your opponent really, really angry by using the Super Energy Removal. Right, where to begin with this card? It defines the meta. It is a gatekeeper that prevents over half the other cards from being viable. Anything that requires 3 or more energy to attack, that can't accelerate energy attachments, is just not competitive. And basics without a single energy attack are similarly limited in their uses. It's simple maths. Since you can usually only attach 1 energy per turn, the ability to remove 2 energy cards sets your opponent back 2 turns. It can deny your opponent ever being able to power something up. It can make their active Pokemon utterly useless, unable to attack or retreat. Not only that, but energy cards are a precious commodity in Base Fossil. With enough energy removals and item finders, you can just win by discarding all of your opponent's energy. 20 energy cards in their discard pile, game over. No mercy. This card is why the meta is divided into 3 types of attackers: single energy attackers, double colourless energy attackers, and energy accelerators. Think you can attach 4 fighting energy one by one, then plough through your opponent's team? Good luck, champ. This card is so good that in every format post-Neo, all the energy removals were totally nerfed to coin flips or supporters. And you know it's a good card when the best decks in the format are all running either full playsets or close to it. Lickitung can run a full playset, or if not, 3 super energy removals alongside 4 item finders. The intention, of course, to stop your opponent from attacking, taking any prizes, and ultimately getting decked out. But other non-stall decks can also be seen with high numbers of super energy removal. Haymaker decks, whether partnered with or without Dodrio, Wigglytuff, are hyper-aggressive and combine disruptive energy removals with fast attacks to overwhelm your opponents and take 6 prizes quickly. What Lickitung and Haymaker cards have in common is that their single energy requirements give them perfect synergy with super energy removal. The energy you've just discarded can be replaced next turn and you're ready to go. The only decks that don't run high numbers of super energy removal are the evolution decks, like Rain Dance, Venusaur or Charizard, slightly due to the lack of deck space, but mainly because their aim is to build up big damage attackers that can score Okos. Why bother removing energy from something when you can just knock it out? Even so, these decks will still likely run at least 1 super energy removal, if not 2. The only deck that probably doesn't run any energy removals whatsoever is Buzz Arcanine, since it's aiming to win in the first couple of turns with big Okos. But, ironically, super energy removal is the card that can completely undo a Buzzap deck in one brutal swoop. Discarding an Electrode and a DCE in a single turn is nearly impossible to recover from. The same with Wigglytuff, a card that, in a format without super energy removal, would be unstoppable. So, as unfair as super energy removal looks, maybe it stops other decks becoming totally broken. Pojo gave super energy removal a 4.5 out of 5. Whatever you think of super energy removal, it defines the base fossil meta, and makes it incredibly skill-based, since you can't just power something up and start swinging. It creates a format where you have to do things like bait your opponent into wasting their super energy removals, wait till you've got a lass in hand, be really strategic about what you're placing energy on and when. There are times when you attach and attack knowing full well that you're going to get supered next turn, so you have to already have your contingency plan ready to go. And yeah, it's super frustrating for new players, and I totally understand why this card was never reprinted post Wizards of the Coast, and even then, I don't think Wizards were expecting this card to make about 2/3 of the Pokemon totally unplayable. Would Base Fossil be a more fun format without it? Probably. Would it be as skillful? Probably not. Either way, this score is a no-brainer. 5 out of 5. Next up, Defender. Attach Defender to one of your Pokemon, discarded at the end of your opponent's next turn. Damage done to that Pokemon is reduced by 20 after weakness and resistance. Pojo gave Defender a 1.5 out of 5, saying, use this Defender trainer card to augment the hit points of your high attack, low hit point attackers. Wow, 1.5 seems pretty harsh. That's the same score they gave Clefairy Doll. Sure, it only lasts for one turn, but it can be very useful. More useful than Clefairy Doll anyway. Preventing 20 damage from your opponent can be useful not just in terms of stalling for time whilst you're set up, but in a one-on-one slugfest. If you can skew the maths in your favour, maybe you'll come out on top. In reality, very few decks play Defender. There are too many other ways to either heal your injured Pokemon or weaken your opponent's attacks with energy removal. The cards that do benefit from Defender are attackers that damage themselves. Buzz Arcanine decks run a couple of Defenders to negate Arcanine's 30 self-damage, as well as protecting it from damage next turn. Same with Buzz Aptos. Another card that benefits from Defender is Electabuzz. If you're running a deck where Electabuzz is your main attacker, I definitely think it's worth including at least a couple of Defenders. You'd think that Defender and Chansey would be a good combo, and to be honest, I'm surprised we don't see this more. Is this a good deck idea? Chansey would only do 60 to itself and prevent 20 damage next turn, meaning it's far more likely to get that 2-for-1 double-edged trade. Metal Chansey works really well in base Neo. Plus, you can hit an 80 damage on a Wigglytuff, survive next turn, and live to fight another day. Maybe I'll head to the deck builder. Pojo gave Defender a 1.5. This seems strangely low for a card that, attached to anything, is fairly useful, but attached to a self-damaging attacker is really useful. Ultimately, it is still a niche card that many top decks like Lickitung, Wigglytuff, Raindance just aren't going to bother with. I guess the question is Defender going to help you more than another top trainer, enough to deserve a space in your deck? In the right deck, I think it can. So I'm giving it a playable 3. Next up, Energy Retrieval. Trade one card from your hand for up to 2 basic energy cards from your discard pile. Pojo gave Energy Retrieval a 3.5 out of 5. This card has gotten more useful as the expansions have come in. Another cryptic allusion to the metagame shifting. Were people beginning to realise the true power of energy removal? Well, in 2025, we certainly do. If you want to beat the top decks, all of which play loads of energy removals, then you need to play Energy Retrieval. Each Energy Retrieval you play gives you 2 extra energy cards in your deck. Sure, you have to discard something, but towards the end game particularly, you'll be more than happy to get rid of a surplus of Oaks or Bills in order to get back that precious, precious energy. Me, I always play 4 Energy Retrievals in every single deck. That's 8 extra energy cards whenever I want them. And I say whenever I want them because you'll always have energies in your discard pile. This is Base Fossil after all. Well, maybe you don't need to run the full playset of Energy Retrievals if you're also running Promo Mewtwo and Ghastly, since they can retrieve energy cards themselves. But for me, every other deck, yeah, play all 4. Raindance, Venusaur, Haymaker, Moltres, everything, especially if you're playing multiple types of energy, since you never want to run out of a specific type. Oh, actually, Buzz Arcanine doesn't need any energy retrievals, since its game plan is to win in the first couple of turns before your opponent can use any energy removals on you. Plus, energy retrieval can't get back those DCs or electrodes. Anyway, every other deck, yeah, play energy retrievals, and I recommend the full 4. Pojo gave Energy Retrieval a 3.5 out of 5. That score reflects a long-distant metagame where energy removals weren't yet running completely rampant. Nowadays, energy retrieval is crucial in any decks that want to withstand the energy removal barrage. Apart from your Buzz-App decks. They've got their own mad strategy going on. Anyway, I'm giving energy retrieval a 4.5. Moving on to Full Heal. Your active Pokemon is no longer asleep, confused, paralysed or poisoned. Pojo gave Full Heal a 1.5 out of 5, with the strat, other trainers are much more useful in your deck. Pretty blunt. And yeah, they're right. Curing a status effect from a Pokemon is obviously good, but there are other ways of doing it using better cards. Basically every deck plays a free retreater, so instead of using Full Heal, you can just play Switch, promote your free retreater, then pivot back into your attacker. Or do the same thing with Scoop Up, which also removes all damage counters in the process. Now, Evolution decks will obviously prefer Switch to Scoop Up, since they don't want to discard their Evolution cards. But in neither case is Full Heal the optimal choice. The only situation where Full Heal is optimal would be you have an Evolution card that's confused or poisoned or whatever, and you don't have either a free retreater or another attacker to switch into. Then, I suppose, a Full Heal would be your best option, but this feels very situational, and Switch still has far greater overall utility. Pojo gave Full Heal a 1.5. I don't think it's quite as bad as this, but it's definitely the worst out of Scoop Up, Switch and itself. I give Full Heal a 2. Time for some maintenance. Shuffle 2 cards from your hand into your deck and draw 1 card. Pojo gave maintenance 2 out of 5 with this likely scenario. Here's how it always works. You shuffle in a Magikarp and a Clefairy Doll and get Magikarp. Ugh. Well, Pojo, not every deck is made up of Magikarps and Clefairy Dolls. But is there much use for a card that makes your hand smaller? Why would you play this when you could just play Bill? Well, you see, okay, there can be some reasons. Firstly, as a pre-Oak play. If you've got evolution cards or item finders in your hand that you don't want to discard with Oak, you can shuffle them back into the safety of your deck. Even if you're not about to Oak, sometimes if your hand is just full of late game cards or useless evolutions, and shuffling them back into your deck and drawing something different can be a sensible play. The most popular deck that you see maintenance in is Rain Dance, for the purposes of saving precious cards like Blastoises or Pokemon Breeders from being discarded whilst you aggressively Oak. Maintenance's other use is as a last-ditch deck replenisher once you've reached that grindy endgame. Maybe that one extra card in deck is enough to survive decking out before your opponent. It might not be as strong as Lass or Gambler in this scenario, but maybe Maintenance can make that game-winning difference. Pojo gave Maintenance a 2. Maintenance is fine. It's no Professor Oak or Bill, but perhaps it's one for the connoisseurs out there. I'm giving Maintenance a 3. Next up, PlusPower. Attach PlusPower to your active Pokemon. For the remainder of your turn, this Pokemon's attacks will do an extra 10 damage after applying weakness and resistance. Pojo gave PlusPower a 3.5 out of 5 with the strat, makes wimps into semi-wimps, and powerhouses into untouchables. It's amazing what 10 extra damage can do. True words from Pojo. 10 extra damage can often be huge in the tight margins of the base fossil meta. PlusPower on a Hitmonchan makes Lickitung go from a 3-hit KO, which will likely be scooped up, to a glorious 2-hit KO. PlusPower on a Charmander can Oko a Scyther. PlusPower on a powered-up Blastoise, Venusaur or Wigglytuff will Oko all those 70 HP Haymaker cards. The existence of PlusPower creates a fantastic level of danger in the base fossil meta, one that requires you to always have a contingency plan up your sleeve. Say your Pokemon has 40 HP left, your opponent has a powered up Scyther. Do they have it? And if they don't, can they get it? And if they do, what are you going to do afterwards? Or if they don't, what were you going to do in the first place? Hopefully that was clear. Anyway, PlusPower can turn a safe board state into a KO out of nowhere, and many games are won with a late game item finder retrieving you that crucial PlusPower. Hitmonchan decks will run more PlusPowers than others, purely for taking out Lickitung in 2 hits. The Potpourri Donk decks will also load up on them. Remember, you can attach more than 1 PlusPower per turn. Attach 4 on turn 1 for the ultimate donk. The only deck that doesn't benefit from PlusPower is Buzz Arcanine. It's doing so much damage, on top of lassing your opponent, it just isn't worth fitting them in the deck. But for every other deck, stall decks included, you're running at least 1 PlusPower, and often several. Pojo gave PlusPower a 3.5. Back in the day when the meta was less optimised, maybe people didn't appreciate how game-changing that 10 extra damage can be. But now it's 2025. We know when to use them, and what to use them on, and, crucially, PlusPowers win you games. I'm giving PlusPower 4.5. Time to head to the Pokemon Center. Remove all damage counters from all of your damaged Pokemon, then discard all energy cards attached to them. Pojo gave Pokemon Center a 4 out of 5, with the strat, a card that can make your opponent's jaw drop in an instant. Alright, well, it's true. A well-timed Pokemon Center totally wipes the board of all your opponent's hard work, and that can be utterly brutal. And the trade-off of discarding energies can be entirely played around in the right decks. And there are 2 decks that are synonymous with Pokemon Center, Venusaur and Alakazam. Venusaur's Energy Trans allows you to move all your energy cards off of your damaged Pokemon onto something undamaged, then heal away every damage counter with that Pokemon Center, without having to discard any energy. Then move all those energy cards back onto whatever you want. It is a brutal move. And Alakazam can essentially do the same thing, but instead of moving energy, you move the actual damage counters, this time onto Pokemon without any energies attached. Heal them, bish bash bosh. It's bad enough seeing all that damage you dealt wiped away in an instant, but it's made worse by the fact that these decks often play huge, high HP beasts that are tough enough to knock out in the first place. But Pokemon Center isn't exclusive to these 2 decks. The top Lickitung stall decks tend to play at least 1 copy, since, their plan is to stop you taking prizes. Plus, these decks don't require much energy to function, so they aren't worried about losing it all when they heal. And to be honest, any decks that are running Pokemon that require only a single energy to attack can benefit from a Pokemon Center in their list. Decks that run Magmar, Clefairy, Hitmonchan, and when your opponent isn't expecting to see a Pokemon Center in your deck, then you play it, it's particularly soul-crushing. And that's what Base Fossil is all about. Pojo gave Pokemon Center a 4. It's crucial in certain niche decks where you'll play maybe 2 or 3 of them, but it's also a great one-off in most of the top decks too. So, I'm keeping its score at a 4. Where's that jaunty music coming from? Perhaps somebody is playing the Pokemon Flute. Choose a basic Pokemon from your opponent's discard pile and put it on their bench. Pojo gave Pokemon Flute a 1.5, with the strat, this is an odd, unessential escape card that does not help as much as many other trainer cards. So, what is the benefit of bringing an opponent's Pokemon back from the Netherrealm and putting them on their bench? Well, the idea is that you put a low HP Pokemon on your opponent's bench in order to gust them in and take an easy prize. This is a genuine strategy in some of the base Neo Dark Bat decks, bringing back 30 HP babies from the discard to KO them next turn with the Bat's bitey Pokemon powers. But in base Fossil, the problem is, there just aren't many low HP Pokemon that you're likely to bring back. The best decks are playing Lickitungs, Hitmonchans, Scythers, Magmars, all cards that you do not want to see back once you've knocked them out. Sure, bringing back Squirtle or Bulbasaur for an easy KO might work once, but you also need Gust in hand and something that can hit them for an OHKO. It all feels like a lot of pieces for one gimmicky knockout. Well, maybe people are asking, why not tech the Flute in as a surprise one-off, just in case? Thing is, one-offs are usually cards like Lass, Gambler, Pokemon Center, Mr. Fuji. Cards that are actually great, but you rarely need lots of in a deck. not Pokemon Flute. Pojo gave Pokemon Flute a 1.5. Maybe there's a cunning Pokemon Flute deck that hasn't been constructed yet, but for the time being, keep your Flute at home in your Flute case. 1.5. Next up, Pokedex. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck and rearrange them as you like. Pojo gave Pokedex 2 out of 5 with the strat: you can start planning your future with this trainer card. It's useful when you're in a long, tough game and need to plan ahead. You know what's better than planning ahead? Just drawing the cards. Pokedex is not a useful card. It's the sort of card that tricks newbies into thinking it'll be helpful, but what good is looking at your cards if you can't touch them? Replace every Pokedex in your deck with an Oak or a Bill ASAP. If you want cards, then draw them. Don't sit there waiting. Your time is now. Pojo gave Pokedex a 2, but I'm giving it a 1.5. Moving on, it's your rival's uncle, Professor Oak. Discard your hand and draw 7 cards. Pojo gave the Professor a perfect 5 out of 5 with the strat: great in many decks, but it takes some skill to use correctly. And you know what, Pojo? You are spot on. Professor Oak is great. It is more than great. It's the best trainer card ever printed. Getting 7 new cards is so good. It gets you set up. It can rescue you from disaster. Card advantage is the name of the game. You want resources, you want energy, you want Pokemon, and Oak gives it to you. It's a card so good that over the years it's got nerfed, then revived, then turned into Pokepowers. Yeah, there are people that will tell you that every base fossil deck needs 4 Professor Oaks, just to give you the highest chance of oaking when you need to. And it's tough to argue. There are certain decks that absolutely need 4 Oaks. Combo decks like Rain Dance and Buzz Arcanine that are looking to find all their puzzle pieces need to draw through their decks aggressively, and since they're aiming to win quick, they ain't worried about decking out. The same with Wigglytuff decks that are looking to fill their bench as quickly as possible to power up Do the Wave, or Haymaker decks that are drawing into their decks in order to get those PlusPowers and other disruptive trainer cards to blitzkrieg their way to 6 prizes. Even stall decks run 4 copies of Oak. They don't use 4 copies of Oak in a game, but it's better to have a Professor Oak in hand that you don't need than to be desperately searching for one. But Pojo were right when they say that playing Professor Oak correctly does require skill. Beware of over-oaking. Unless Oak is the last card in your hand, you're going to be discarding other cards. And you need to make sure that those cards discarded can either be retrieved later, or you're sure that you can afford to get rid of them. Oaking away evolution cards, double Colorless energies, or item finders always feels brutal, so make sure it's worth it, or you might want to consider just holding out one more turn. And the other risk of over-oaking is decking out. Those turbo decks that fail to win quickly doom themselves to a deck out loss. You're most likely going to need Oak at least once per game, maybe twice if your opponent is drawing liberally, but beware oaking any more than that. Pojo gave Professor Oak a 5. Lots of decks play 4 of these chaps. Some decks like Venusaur, Dragonite or Alakazam probably don't need the full playset, but 3 Oaks minimum I'd say is mandatory. They're just too important to risk having them all prized. Anyway, for my money, it's the best trainer ever. Nothing beats that warm feeling of drawing the Professor. A perfect 5. Next up, Revive. Put 1 basic Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench. Put damage counters on it equal to half its HP. Pojo gave Revive a 1.5 out of 5, with the strat: useful only if you have a dead Pokemon you want revived and a spot on the bench. This card provides a good late game move. Now, Revive is one of only 2 cards in Base Fossil, along with Recycle, that allows you to get back your Pokemon from the discard pile. The problem is, your Pokemon only has half its HP left. In most cases, this sounds like a sitting duck for your opponent's Gust of Wind. And there really aren't many scenarios where your only way to win is to bring back a certain Pokemon from the discard, switch into it, and then use its single energy attack to take the prize you need. Maybe the Potpourri Donk decks can use Revive for this sort of kamikaze mayhem? One rather interesting idea for Revive is to combo it with Alakazam. You can deliberately discard basics with cards like Oak or Computer Search, revive them, then move all of those damage counters onto something else. Or you revive something beefy like Chansey, then move all of those damage counters onto something like a Tauros or Dodrio and unleash a big damage Rampage or Rage attack. It's a very fun idea, but the combo of Alakazam, which is already fragile, and a rogue trainer like Revive all sounds a bit risky. But maybe comboed with Alas, it might catch your opponent off guard long enough to steamroll them. Pojo gave Revive a 1.5. If only for the damage swap Rage combo, I think there's something to explore with Revive. Aside from that, I wouldn't bother making the deck space for Revive in any of the top decks. I give Revive a 2. Next up, Super Potion. Discard one energy card from one of your Pokemon in order to heal it of 40 damage. Pojo gave Super Potion a 2.5 out of 5 with a strat. The Super Potion Trainer card offers a fair trade, assuming you're both high on energy and damage. I think I agree with Pojo. Healing 40 for 1 energy is a good trade. The problem is, if you're running Pokemon that only need 1 energy to attack, you're better off running either Scoop Up or Pokemon Center. If you're only sacrificing 1 energy, you might as well heal them fully, instead of just for 40. And there are certain cards that you don't want to be discarding energy cards off of, like Wigglytuff, which is already a massive energy removal target. But there are some cards that Super Potion works well with. Promo Mewtwo can instantly recover the energy it discards after being healed with Super Potion with energy absorption. And Blastoise can afford Super Potion since Rain Dance can just replace that discarded energy with as many other energy cards as you like. Pojo gave Super Potion a 2.5. You do see Super Potion every now and again, usually in Rain Dance, and it's totally fine. Since Rain Dance's attackers require lots of energy cards on them to attack, I guess they don't want to be either scooped up or Pokemon centered and have all those energies discarded. So, for Rain Dance, Super Potion is the best healing option. For that very reason, I give it a 3 out of 5. Who's that disguised as Kabuto? It's Bill. Draw 2 cards. Pojo gave Bill a perfect 5 out of 5 with the strat. A common gets a 5 rating. Yup, it sure does. Can you say card advantage? And yes, I can. Card advantage. Draw 2 cards. Why wouldn't you? Well, late game maybe you don't want to draw 2 cards if you're engaged in a deck out war, but yeah, usually, great. I'll take 2 more cards. The more cards you have in hand, the more stuff you can do. So, aggressive decks like Rain Dance, Buzz Arcanine, Haymaker, Wigglytuff all want to be drawing cards, so they all play 4 Bill. Even slower tempo evolution decks often play quad Bills. Venusaur and Dragonite want to draw, but without necessarily discarding valuable evolution cards with Professor Oak, so Bill becomes a much safer option. The only decks where you won't find Bill are the Licky Tongue Stool decks. These decks aren't interested in drawing cards, they're all about grinding the game to a halt and stockpiling resources. If they find themselves in trouble or need to get set up ASAP, they'll draw with a Professor Oak. Bill is just a bit too low calorie for these gourmet builds. Pojo gave Bill a perfect 5. It's tough to argue, but as great as Bill is, it's not a game-winning card. They're sort of like the They're sort of like WD-40 for your deck, keeping it ticking along nice and smooth. Plus, it's not required in the format's best deck, so I can't really give it the top score. But I still love you, Bill. 4.5. Uh-oh, here comes another unpopular character. Energy removal. Choose one energy card attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon and discard it. Pojo gave energy removal a 4 out of 5 with the strat. Although this card doesn't get your opponent as mad as super energy removal, it'll get him or her angry enough. So yeah, Another card that defines the early TCG formats, and a card that can feel totally unfair and spoil sporty. It's not as devastating as super energy removal, but normal energy removal doesn't require you to discard anything. It's totally free. Now, of course you can use this card to discard an energy from whatever Pokemon you like, but if you're up against a single energy attacker, it might not necessarily be worth playing it. Believe it or not, you don't have to discard energy just because you can. The best two uses for energy removal are as follows. Preventing your opponent from building up a big energy attacker. Chansey is a prime example. And, best of all, targeting those precious DCEs. Saving up your energy removals just for getting rid of DCEs is the ideal strategy. Your opponents can only play 4 DCEs, and decks like Wigglytuff absolutely rely on them to do anything. Not to mention other popular Pokemon like Dodrio, Ditto, Cypher, and the aforementioned Chansey. If you can take out their final DCE with an energy removal, you might have just won the game. Similar to its super counterpart, you'll find a full playset of energy removals in Lickitung stall decks and in most Wigglytuff and Haymaker variants, as well as 1 or 2 in your Rain Dances, Venusaurs and other evolution decks. Pojo gave energy removal a 4. It's not as meta-warping as super removal, but it still epitomises the aggressive playstyle of Base Fossil and the importance of careful resource management. I'm giving energy removal a 4.5. Next up, Gust of Wind. Switch your opponent's active Pokemon with one of their benched Pokemon. Pojo gave Gust a 4.5 out of 5 with the strat, a very useful card. Blow in a low HP Pokemon from your opponent's bench for a light snack. Again, another card that defines an era. A card so good that future copies are either nerfed or printed as supporters. Gust has 3 uses. Stranding a Pokemon with a high retreat or that's resisted, thus allowing you time to set up, or late game, potentially stall your opponent to victory. Your opponent ain't going to be happy when you gust out their Charizard when you've got Mr. Mime active and they've only got 2 cards left in deck. Number 2. Score a knockout. Your opponent thinks their Magikarp is safe on the bench? Gust, KO. That benched Chansey only has 10 HP left? Gust, KO. Your opponent sends out Cypher to stall Hitmonchan. Gust out Electabuzz and start swinging. And 3. Put a stop to those sneaky bench sitters and their pesky Pokemon powers. Cards like Blastoise, Venusaur, Muck, Aerodactyl and especially Alakazam can just sit on the bench and control a game with their powers. Gust them active and put a special condition on them, or even better, knock them out to regain the upper hand. And here's the reason that every deck needs at least one Gust. Without Gust of Wind, Alakazam decks would be almost unbeatable, but the very existence of Gust ends up making them very unreliable. And as great as Gust is, no deck needs 4 of them. There's no point gusting out something that can easily retreat next turn, unless you're going to KO it. If you're not doing one of the above 3 things, hold on to your Gusts, because it's late game when Gust of Winds are worth their weight in Pokegold. So many games are won with a final turn Gust, and it's one of those cards, like Lass or PlusPower, that must be one of the most item-finded cards in the entire format. Gust of Wind. Pojo gave Gust of Wind 4.5 out of 5. It's a truly game-winning card that every deck needs to play. It's disruptive, it's aggressive, and it's still a 4.5. Next up, Potion. Remove 2 damage counters from one of your Pokemon. Pojo gave Potion a 2 out of 5 with the strat. Like the name implies, it's not as good as a Super Potion card. This card is less expensive, but less powerful. Healing 20 damage is fine, but to be honest, not worth a space in your deck over the other incredible trainers out there. Scoop Up, Pokemon Center, these make Potion look decidedly unimpressive. The only card that really works well alongside Potion is Mr. Mime. Since it can only take a max of 20 damage per turn, getting to instantly remove all that with Potion is pretty handy. I can also see Potion being useful in the Potpourri Donk decks to keep your low HP Staryus and Ponytas conscious for one more round. However, I can't help thinking that Defender is just a better version of Potion. Why heal 20 damage when you can just prevent it from ever happening? Plus, it has the added utility of stopping self-damage. Weird that Pojo gave Defender a worse score than Potion. Oh well. Pojo gave Potion a 2. And yeah, you're very unlikely to see Potions in any competitive decks, but maybe they have some niche uses? I guess they're fine. I'll give Potion a 2.5. And finally, the last trainer of base set, Switch. Switch one of your bench Pokemon with your active Pokemon. Pojo gave Switch a 2 out of 5 with the strat. This trainer card is Gust of Wind in reverse. That's not good if your bench consists of Magikarp, Caterpie and Porygon. I mean, nothing's going to do you much good if you're running a Magikarp, Caterpie and Porygon deck. Is it the same deck that runs Magikarp, Clefairy Doll in maintenance from earlier? What is this deck? Anyway, Pojo seemed to be a bit confused by Switch. A Gust of Wind in reverse would mean your opponent would choose your benched Pokemon that becomes active. But of course, that's not how Switch works. Switch does what it says. Allows you to switch out a Pokemon, bypassing its retreat cost. Why would you do this? Well, if your opponent resists your attacker, switch into a new one. About to be KO'd but can't pay the retreat cost? Switch into something else. Had a high retreater Gust if active and stranded? Switch them out of there. And if your active is afflicted with a status condition, you switch to move them to the bench, cure them of their ailment, promote a free retreater, then pivot back into them. Or any other card you like. As mentioned in the Scoop Up segment, Switch is a card that you'll see mostly in evolution decks that aren't running Dodrio. These decks tend to be Stage 2 decks like Rain Dance, Venusaur, Alakazam, Charizard. You don't want to scoop these cards up since you'll lose their evolution cards, but these are all examples of Pokemon that can be targets for Gust of Winds to either be afflicted with a Pokemon power preventing status condition or just left stranded active. In moments like this, Switch is your saviour. Switch is also an option in Haymaker decks that aren't running Dodrio. Hitmonchans or Mewtwo's getting walled by resistant Pokemon can be scooped up, but if you don't want to lose all your energy cards, then a switch or two can come in handy. In general, Switch isn't as powerful as Scoop Up, since you're not removing damage counters. As such, you won't see Switch in the top tier decks that are running big basics like the Licky Tongue Stools, or the Haymaker variants that run Dodrio, which allow you to retreat for free. But for those big, beefy Stage 2 decks, or other evolution decks that aren't running Dodrio, Switch is your go-to card to save your stranded monsters. And I'd say that you'll want to be playing either 2, maybe 3 Switches in these type of decks. Pojo gave Switch a bafflingly harsh 2. Every deck needs some sort of switching option. That's either Dodrio, Scoop Up, or Switch. Switch is a card that has been reprinted expansion after expansion, and sure, it's not the flashiest card in the world, but it can totally get you out of some dire situations. I'm giving Switch a 3.5. And that's it! All the trainers, but wait. Pojo also gave a few more base set ratings, and I'd get in trouble for not mentioning them. Double Colorless Energy. Pojo gave Double Colorless Energy a 4.5 out of 5 with the strat. A commonly misunderstood card. You can only have 4 or fewer of these in your deck because they're not basic energy. Great for colourless attacks. And look, I'll keep this brief. Most of the top decks play 4 DCEs. They're vital for Wigglytuffs, Scythers, Chanseys, Dittos, Dodrios, Charizards. The list is a long one. I give Double Colorless Energy a 5 out of 5. But wait, Pojo gave even more ratings. They rated all the basic energies too. I'm not making this up. All the basic energy cards get a perfect 5 out of 5, and the strategy tip that Pojo gave to all of them is the same. The number of these energy cards that you have in your hand depends on the strategy you're playing. Words of wisdom indeed. Sure. But there you have it. Trainers done. Here are Pojo's scores from 1999 and my re-rated scores from 26 years later. To be fair, Pojo's trainer ratings are generally pretty spot on, with nothing too egregious, although they're surprisingly harsh on Defender and Switch. Oh well. That's it. Base set complete. But the journey doesn't end here. Soon we'll be entering the jungle, where arguably the format's strongest Pokemon await us. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. See you in the next video. Old Rod, out.